April 23rd, 1946. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rubble-strewn streets of Mannheim, Germany, where Sergeant James Washington of the 361st Infantry Regiment stood guard outside a displaced persons camp. The air carried the scent of reconstruction dust and hope, mixed with the lingering echoes of a continent trying to rebuild itself. Washington adjusted his uniform, the same olive drab that had carried him through the liberation of Europe, now serving a different purpose in a land where yesterday's enemies had become today's responsibility. He believed, like most of his fellow soldiers, that the hardest part of the conflict was behind them, that peace would bring clarity to the moral complexities they had witnessed. How wrong they would all prove to be about the challenges that lay ahead in occupied Germany, where the lines between liberation and occupation, justice and mercy, would blur in ways none of them had anticipated. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a routine day of peacekeeping duties would transform into a moment that challenged everything James Washington thought he knew about courage, justice, and the true meaning of standing up for what was right, regardless of the color of someone's skin or the flag they once served under. The 361st Infantry Regiment had arrived in Mannheim 3 weeks earlier as part of the broader American occupation forces tasked with maintaining order in the British zone of Germany. For Sergeant Washington, a 24-year-old from Detroit, whose father had worked the assembly lines at Ford Motor Company, this assignment represented both an honor and a burden. He had earned his stripes during the Italian campaign, where his unit had distinguished itself in the fighting around Monte Cassino and later during the push through southern France. Now, instead of facing German soldiers across contested battlefields, he found himself responsible for protecting German civilians in a defeated nation struggling to find its footing. The displaced persons camp outside Mannheim housed nearly 2,000 individuals from across Europe, people whose lives had been shattered by 6 years of global conflict. Among them were Polish laborers, French prisoners, Belgian refugees, and a smaller but significant population of German civilians who had fled westward as the Soviet forces advanced. The camp operated under strict Allied supervision, with American, British, and French personnel working to process the massive humanitarian challenge of repatriating millions of displaced people across the continent. Washington's daily routine involved perimeter security, camp inspections, and coordination with civilian relief organizations. The International Red Cross maintained a permanent presence at the facility, along with representatives from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, known as UNRWA, which had been established specifically to handle the enormous scale of post-war displacement. The statistics were staggering. Across all of occupied Germany, more than 7 million displaced persons required processing, feeding, housing, and eventual repatriation to their home countries. The sergeant's education at Detroit's Northeastern High School had included courses in European history, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of managing a population that included former forced laborers alongside German refugees. The administrative complexity alone was overwhelming. Each person required documentation, medical screening, and individual assessment to determine their proper classification under Allied protocols. Some were clearly victims of German wartime policies, while others represented the civilian population of a defeated nation. The moral mathematics of occupation duty proved far more complicated than the clear objectives of wartime service. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Mills, commanding officer of the 361st, had briefed his men extensively on the delicate nature of their mission. Mills, a career officer from Virginia who had graduated from the Virginia Military Institute in 1931, understood that the success of the American occupation would depend largely on the conduct of individual soldiers in their daily interactions with German civilians. The United States Army had issued detailed guidelines on fraternization policies, non-cooperation with former regime sympathizers, and the maintenance of military discipline in a civilian environment. The regulations were explicit. American personnel were forbidden from developing personal relationships with German nationals, accepting gifts or hospitality from local civilians, or engaging in any conduct that might compromise their status as representatives of the occupying power. Violations could result in court-martial proceedings and immediate transfer from occupation duty. These policies reflected broader American concerns about the reliability of German civilian cooperation and the potential for underground resistance activities. However, the reality of daily camp operations made strict adherence to non-fraternization policies nearly impossible. American soldiers worked alongside German translators, relied on German medical professionals for camp health services, and coordinated with German administrative personnel for logistical support. The practical necessities of managing 2,000 displaced persons required a level of cooperation that complicated the official policy of maintaining distance from the German population. Sergeant Washington had developed a working relationship with several German staff members at the camp, including Dr. Wilhelm Steiner, a 53-year-old physician from Munich who had served as a military medical officer during the conflict but now worked with displaced persons under American supervision. Dr. Steiner spoke excellent English, having studied at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore during the 1920s, before returning to Germany to establish his medical practice. His presence at the camp reflected the complex reality of post-war Germany, where former military personnel often found themselves working for the occupying powers out of economic necessity and genuine desire to contribute to reconstruction efforts. Another key figure was Margaret Hoffmann, a 31-year-old former schoolteacher from Frankfurt who served as the primary German liaison for educational services within the camp. Hoffmann had lost her position in the German school system due to her documented refusal to teach certain ideological materials during the war years, a stance that had brought her to the attention of local authorities, but ultimately saved her from more serious consequences after the German surrender. Her fluency in English, French, and Polish made her invaluable for communication with the diverse camp population. The camp's daily operations required coordination between American military personnel, Allied civilian administrators, and German support staff. Morning briefings at 0700 hours included personnel from all these groups, reviewing security reports, medical updates, food distribution schedules, and repatriation processing. The logistics were staggering. The camp consumed approximately 4,200 pounds of bread daily, along with 1,800 gallons of milk, 2,600 pounds of meat, and thousands of pounds of vegetables and other provisions. Washington's specific responsibilities included supervising the camp's perimeter security detail, which consisted of 12 American soldiers working in rotating shifts around the clock. The perimeter encompassed approximately 120 acres, including residential barracks, administrative buildings, medical facilities, dining halls, recreational areas, and storage warehouses. Security concerns ranged from preventing unauthorized departures by displaced persons awaiting repatriation to deterring potential infiltration by black market operators seeking to exploit the camp's resources. The economic situation in post-war Germany had created a thriving black market economy, with cigarettes, coffee, chocolate, and medical supplies commanding extraordinary prices among the German civilian population. A single pack of American cigarettes could be traded for enough food to feed a German family for several days. Coffee, virtually unavailable through legitimate channels, was worth more than its weight in silver. These economic distortions created constant pressure on camp security, as both displaced persons and German civilians sought opportunities to engage in unauthorized trading. On this particular April afternoon, Washington was conducting his regular perimeter inspection when he noticed unusual activity near the camp's eastern gate. A crowd of approximately 30 German civilians had gathered outside the fence, their voices rising in what appeared to be an agitated discussion. Among them, he recognized several faces from the local community: Hans Müller, a former factory foreman whose plant had been dismantled under Allied reparations policies; Wilhelm Braun, whose son had been reported missing on the Eastern Front; and Gerhard Koch, a merchant whose family had lost their home during the Allied bombing campaigns. The crowd's attention seemed focused on a young woman who was attempting to leave the camp through the Eastern Gate. Washington immediately recognized her as Greta Zimmermann, a 22-year-old from Cologne, who had arrived at the camp 6 days earlier. under circumstances that remained unclear in her official documentation. Unlike most of the German civilians in the facility, who were clearly refugees from the Eastern Territories, Zimmermann's paperwork indicated only that she had been found by American forces in a liberated labor camp near Dachau, though she did not appear to be Jewish or Polish. The administrative complexity of Zimmermann's case had made her a subject of particular interest for camp officials. Her documentation was incomplete, with gaps that suggested either deliberately concealed information or simply the chaos that had characterized the final months of the conflict. She spoke fluent German and adequate English, but claimed to have no family connections who could verify her identity or provide clarification about her wartime experiences. This combination of factors had placed her in administrative limbo, while Allied personnel worked to determine her proper classification. What made Zimmermann's situation even more complicated was her apparent familiarity with medical procedures and terminology, suggesting possible employment in a medical facility during the war years. However, she had consistently denied any association with German military medical services, maintaining that her knowledge came from civilian nursing training in Cologne before the conflict. The inconsistencies in her account had raised questions among camp administrators about her true background and the circumstances that had led to her presence in the labor camp where American forces had found her. As Washington approached the Eastern Gate, he could hear fragments of the crowd's conversation, conducted in rapid German that his limited language skills could not fully comprehend. However, the emotional tenor was unmistakable: anger, resentment, and something approaching hostility. The crowd's body language suggested a confrontation building toward some kind of action, with several individuals moving closer to the fence while others gestured emphatically toward Zimmermann. The young woman stood just inside the gate, apparently frozen by indecision about whether to proceed through the exit or retreat back into the camp. She wore a simple gray dress provided by camp supplies, along with worn black shoes and a thin brown coat that offered little protection against the cool April weather. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical style, and her pale complexion showed the effects of inadequate nutrition that characterized most displaced persons during this period. Washington's training had prepared him for various scenarios involving crowd control, civil disturbance, and security threats to camp operations. However, the current situation presented complexities that went beyond standard military protocols. The crowd consisted entirely of German civilians who had legitimate business in the area and were not technically violating any occupation regulations by gathering outside the camp. At the same time, their obvious focus on Zimmermann suggested the potential for an incident that could compromise camp security and individual safety. The sergeant's position required him to balance multiple considerations: maintaining the security of camp operations, protecting the safety of displaced persons under American supervision, avoiding unnecessary confrontation with German civilians, and adhering to occupation policies that governed interactions between military personnel and the local population. The situation demanded immediate decision-making without the luxury of consulting superior officers or referring to detailed regulations. As Washington moved closer to the gate, he caught the attention of Corporal Robert Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco, who served as the camp's primary interpreter. Chen's language skills included German, Polish, and French, making him invaluable for communication with both displaced persons and local civilians. His presence at the Eastern Gate suggested that he, too, had recognized the potential for trouble in the developing situation. "What's the situation, Corporal?" Washington asked, keeping his voice low to avoid attracting additional attention from the gathering crowd. Chen's expression was serious as he replied, "The locals are pretty worked up about something, Sergeant. Near as I can tell, they're claiming that the woman inside the gate was involved with some kind of medical facility during the war. They're using words I don't fully recognize, but the tone suggests they think she was collaborating with German authorities in some capacity." Washington nodded, processing this information while observing the crowd's behavior. Several individuals were now pointing directly at Zimmermann, and their voices had risen to levels that suggested anger rather than mere curiosity. The woman herself appeared increasingly distressed, glancing back toward the camp buildings as if considering retreat while simultaneously moving closer to the gate. as though determined to proceed with whatever business had brought her to the exit. "Any indication of what kind of medical facility they're talking about?" Washington asked. "That's where it gets complicated," Chen responded. "Some of the terms they're using suggest military medical services, but others sound like they're talking about civilian healthcare. Could be they're just angry about anyone who worked for German authorities during the occupation, regardless of the specific details." This explanation aligned with Washington's broader understanding of post-war dynamics in occupied Germany. Many German civilians harbored resentment toward anyone they perceived as having collaborated with wartime authorities, particularly if such collaboration had continued during the final months when it became clear that defeat was inevitable. At the same time, the practical realities of wartime life had required millions of Germans to maintain some level of cooperation with official institutions, making the moral mathematics of collaboration more complex than simple categories of guilt and innocence might suggest. The crowd outside the gate had now grown to approximately 40 individuals, with new arrivals continuing to join the gathering. Among the newer faces, Washington recognized Maria Hoffman, an elderly woman whose family had operated a small grocery store before the war, and Johann Weber, a middle-aged man who had worked as a postal clerk, but had lost his position due to Allied policies regarding former civil servants. Their presence suggested that word of the situation was spreading through the local community. Zimmermann had now reached the gate itself, her hand resting on the latch mechanism while she stared at the crowd gathered beyond the fence. Her expression showed a mixture of determination and fear, suggesting that she understood the nature of the accusations being directed toward her, while remaining committed to whatever objective had brought her to this point. The contrast between her slight physical appearance and the size of the crowd created an inherently dramatic tableau that seemed to capture the broader tensions of the post-war period. Washington made a quick assessment of available options. Standard military protocol would suggest securing the gate, preventing Zimmermann's departure, and dispersing the crowd through demonstration of military authority. However, such an approach risked escalating the situation unnecessarily while potentially violating Zimmermann's rights as a displaced person seeking to leave the camp voluntarily. Allied policies emphasized that displaced persons were not prisoners and retained the right to depart camp facilities unless specific legal restrictions applied to their cases. An alternative approach would involve allowing Zimmermann to proceed through the gate while maintaining sufficient military presence to ensure her safety and prevent any escalation to physical confrontation. This strategy carried its own risks, particularly if the crowd's intentions went beyond verbal harassment to actual violence. Washington's responsibility for camp security required him to prevent any incident that might compromise the safety of personnel under American supervision. The developing situation also reflected broader themes that characterized the American occupation experience in post-war Germany. Questions of justice, revenge, collaboration, and forgiveness played out daily in thousands of individual encounters between occupying forces, displaced persons, and German civilians. The moral clarity that had characterized wartime objectives had given way to the ambiguous complexities of peacetime administration, where former enemies became responsibilities and former allies sometimes proved unreliable. As Washington weighed his options, he noticed that the crowd's attention was beginning to shift toward him and Corporal Chen. Several individuals were pointing in their direction while engaging in animated discussion, suggesting recognition of the American military presence and speculation about how the soldiers might respond to the situation. This development added another layer of complexity, as any action Washington took would be observed and interpreted by the German civilian population as representative of broader American occupation policies. The sergeant's personal background included extensive experience with hostile crowds and civil unrest from his pre-war years in Detroit, where racial tensions and labor disputes had sometimes erupted into public confrontations. However, those situations had involved American civilians, American law enforcement, and familiar legal frameworks. The current scenario required navigation of military occupation protocols, international law regarding displaced persons, and diplomatic considerations related to German-American relations during the Reconstruction period. Washington's unit had received briefings on the importance of maintaining positive relationships with German civilians while avoiding any appearance of weakness or indecision in security matters. The balance between these objectives proved challenging in practice, particularly when situations developed rapidly and required immediate responses without opportunities for consultation with superior officers. Every decision made by individual soldiers reflected on the broader American occupation effort and contributed to German perceptions of American competence and fairness. As the crowd outside the gate continued to grow and become more agitated, Zimmermann finally opened the latch and stepped through the gate onto the public street beyond the camp perimeter. Her action triggered an immediate response from the gathered civilians, with several individuals moving toward her, while others called out accusations in German. The woman's response was to stand straighter and face the crowd directly, suggesting either courage or resignation to whatever confrontation was about to unfold. At this critical moment, Washington made his decision. Moving quickly but deliberately, he approached the gate and positioned himself between Zimmermann and the advancing crowd members. His 6'2" frame and military bearing created an imposing presence, while his uniform clearly identified him as representing American authority in the area. Without looking back at Zimmermann, he spoke in a voice loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. "Get behind me," he ordered, his tone carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed under pressure. The effect of Washington's intervention was immediate and dramatic. The advancing crowd members stopped their forward movement, suddenly confronted with the reality that any action against Zimmermann would necessarily involve confrontation with American military personnel. The legal and practical implications of such a confrontation were sobering, as occupation authorities had made clear that attacks on Allied personnel or their protectees would be treated as serious criminal offenses subject to military tribunal proceedings. However, Washington's decision to interpose himself between the German civilians and Zimmermann created complexities that went beyond immediate crowd control. His action represented a clear choice to protect a German civilian against the wishes of other German civilians, effectively taking sides in what appeared to be an internal German dispute about wartime collaboration. Such involvement contradicted official policies that discouraged American personnel from becoming entangled in local German political or social conflicts. The sergeant's motivation for this decision drew from multiple sources: his professional responsibility for the safety of displaced persons under American supervision, his personal moral code regarding protection of individuals facing mob intimidation, and perhaps most significantly, his own experience as a member of a racial minority who had faced similar crowd hostility in civilian life. The parallels between Zimmermann's current situation and countless incidents of racial violence in American communities were uncomfortably obvious to someone who had grown up in Detroit during the 1930s. The crowd's reaction to Washington's intervention revealed the complex dynamics of power, authority, and resentment that characterized German-American relations during the occupation period. Some individuals immediately stepped back, recognizing the futility of challenging American military authority in a direct confrontation. Others appeared more defiant, their anger at wartime circumstances and post-war hardships overriding their practical assessment of the situation. Still others seemed confused by the unexpected development, uncertain how to respond to American protection of someone they viewed as deserving of punishment. Corporal Chen had followed Washington's lead, positioning himself to provide backup support while maintaining communication capabilities with other camp personnel. His presence reinforced the message that the American intervention represented official military action rather than individual soldier initiative. At the same time, Chen's position allowed him to continue monitoring the crowd's conversation and provide real-time intelligence about their intentions and level of hostility. "Sergeant," Chen said quietly, "they're arguing among themselves now. Some want to leave, but others are saying they can't let her get away. There's talk about contacting German police authorities, but others are pointing out that the police are under Allied supervision anyway." This information confirmed Washington's assessment that the situation remained volatile despite his intervention. The crowd's indecision about how to respond created opportunities for de-escalation, but also potential for unpredictable actions by individuals who might act without group consensus. Managing such situations required continuous assessment and adaptation as circumstances evolved. Behind Washington, Zimmerman remained silent but had moved closer to his position, accepting his protection while maintaining her own dignity and composure. Her response suggested both gratitude for his intervention and understanding of the delicate nature of the situation. The young woman's behavior indicated familiarity with crisis management and ability to function under pressure, supporting earlier observations about her possible medical training or wartime experience in challenging environments. The standoff continued for several minutes, with the crowd maintaining their positions while Washington and Chen provided a barrier between the civilians and Zimmerman. During this interval, the sergeant had opportunity to observe individual crowd members more carefully and assess their likely responses to different de-escalation strategies. Some appeared to be following the lead of more aggressive individuals, while others seemed primarily motivated by curiosity about the unfolding drama. Among the crowd, Washington noticed an older man who appeared to be attempting to moderate the group's response. This individual, perhaps 60 years old, with graying hair and worn civilian clothing, was speaking quietly to several of the more agitated crowd members while gesturing toward the American soldiers. His body language suggested someone trying to counsel restraint and avoid escalation to direct confrontation with occupation authorities. The moderating influence of this individual created an opening for Washington to attempt de-escalation through dialogue rather than continued confrontation. Approaching crowds in an authoritative but non-threatening manner had been covered in his military training, though always in the context of American civilian situations rather than occupied territory with complex international legal implications. "Corporal Chen," Washington said, "ask that older gentleman if he speaks English. If not, see if you can translate for a conversation." Chen stepped forward and addressed the crowd in German, identifying the older man and making Washington's request. After a brief exchange, the corporal reported back. "His name is Heinrich Brenner, and he speaks some English. Says he was a shop foreman before the war and learned English from American engineers who visited his factory. He's willing to talk, but wants to know if you're going to arrest anyone." Washington considered this question carefully. His authority as an American soldier in occupied Germany included powers of detention for security purposes, but exercising such powers in the current situation would likely escalate rather than resolve the confrontation. At the same time, he could not appear to be negotiating from a position of weakness or uncertainty about his legal authority. "Tell Mr. Brenner that no one is under arrest at this time, but that depends on everyone's behavior going forward," Washington responded. "Ask him to step forward so we can discuss this situation calmly." Heinrich Brenner approached slowly, his hands visible and his demeanor respectful but not submissive. His appearance suggested someone who had worked with his hands throughout his life, with calloused fingers and the kind of practical clothing favored by skilled tradesmen. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear, indicating genuine familiarity with the language rather than mere tourist-level knowledge. "Sergeant," Brenner began, "I think perhaps there is misunderstanding here. The woman, we know her from before the war ended. She worked at medical facility near here, place where—" Brenner paused, seeming to search for appropriate English terminology to describe something that clearly carried emotional weight for him and the other crowd members. "Place where German soldiers were treated, but also where other people came who were hurt. Some say she helped German authorities, others say she tried to help everyone who needed medical care. But when Soviet forces came close, she left with German personnel. People here, they lost family members, they suffered much. They want to know why she was in labor camp if she was helping Germans." This explanation provided crucial context for understanding the crowd's motivation and the nature of their accusations against Zimmerman. Rather than simple vindictiveness or xenophobia, their hostility appeared to stem from genuine confusion about her role during the war's final months and suspicion about her subsequent treatment by Allied forces. The implication that she had worked at a medical facility, serving both German military personnel and other patients, suggested the kind of morally ambiguous situation that characterized much of wartime civilian life. Washington processed this information while maintaining his protective position relative to Zimmerman. The revelation that she had worked at a medical facility aligned with earlier observations about her familiarity with medical terminology and procedures. However, the circumstances described by Brenner raised additional questions about her presence in the labor camp where American forces had found her and the gaps in her official documentation. "Mr. Brenner," Washington replied, "I appreciate you explaining the situation, but regardless of what happened during the war, this woman is currently under American protection as a displaced person. Any questions about her wartime activities need to be addressed through proper legal channels, not through crowd confrontation." Brenner nodded slowly, suggesting understanding of Washington's position while continuing to look troubled by the broader situation. "Yes, Sergeant, we understand about American authority. But this woman, she knows things about what happened to people from our community. Some families, they never found out what happened to their sons, their husbands. She might have information that could help them understand." This perspective added another dimension to the confrontation, suggesting that the crowd's interest in Zimmerman might include legitimate desire for information about missing family members rather than purely vengeful motivations. Such circumstances were tragically common throughout post-war Europe, where millions of families sought information about relatives who had disappeared during the conflict's chaotic final months. Washington recognized the validity of Brenner's concerns while maintaining his responsibility for Zimmerman's immediate safety. The tension between individual protection and community justice needs reflected broader challenges facing occupation authorities throughout Germany, where competing claims of victimhood and accountability complicated efforts to establish stable post-war governance. If that's the case, and Washington said, then the proper approach is to contact Allied authorities who can arrange for official questioning through appropriate channels. What I cannot allow is any situation where someone under American protection is threatened or intimidated, regardless of the reasons. Behind Washington, Zimmerman had remained silent throughout the exchange with Brenner, but her posture suggested that she was following the conversation and understanding both its explicit content and its broader implications. Her reaction would provide important information about her willingness to cooperate with any official investigation of her wartime activities. After several moments of silence, Zimmerman stepped slightly forward and spoke for the first time since leaving the camp. "I will answer questions," she said in English, her voice quiet but clear. "But not here, not like this. If there are proper authorities, if there are families who need to know about their relatives, I will speak with them through correct procedures." Her statement demonstrated both courage and practical wisdom, acknowledging the crowd's concerns while establishing reasonable conditions for addressing them. The offer to cooperate with official investigation processes provided a potential path forward that could satisfy community needs for information while maintaining appropriate legal protections for all parties involved. Brenner translated Zimmerman's statement to the crowd in German, generating immediate discussion among the gathered civilians. Washington could observe various reactions. Some individuals appeared satisfied by her offer to cooperate, while others seemed skeptical about whether official Allied procedures would produce meaningful results for their information needs. The complexity of post-war justice processes had created widespread frustration among German civilians, seeking information about missing relatives or accountability for wartime actions. Allied military tribunals and denazification proceedings often focused on high-level officials and major war criminals, leaving many community-level concerns unaddressed through formal legal channels. This gap between official justice mechanisms and local accountability needs contributed to situations like the current confrontation. After several minutes of crowd discussion, Brenner addressed Washington again. "Sergeant, the people here, they agree that women should speak with authorities, but they want to know when this will happen, and they want to know that American officials will take their concerns seriously. Many times we have been told that problems will be addressed through proper channels, but then nothing happens." Washington understood the frustration underlying Brenner's statement. The American Occupation Administration faced enormous challenges in managing post-war justice and accountability processes, while simultaneously maintaining order and promoting reconstruction. Limited resources and competing priorities often resulted in delayed or incomplete responses to community concerns, creating cynicism about official promises of proper investigation. "I can promise you that I will personally ensure this matter is reported to appropriate authorities today," Washington replied. "I cannot guarantee specific outcomes, but I can guarantee that official attention will be given to the questions that have been raised." This commitment represented the maximum assurance Washington could provide within his authority, while avoiding promises about matters beyond his control. His personal guarantee of immediate reporting offered more credible assurance than general references to proper procedures, while his acknowledgement of limited control over outcomes demonstrated honesty about the constraints of his position. The exchange between Washington and Brenner had served to de-escalate the immediate confrontation, while establishing a framework for addressing the underlying community concerns through appropriate channels. However, the practical challenge remained of safely concluding the current situation and ensuring that all parties could disengage without loss of dignity or renewed potential for conflict. Zimmerman's willingness to cooperate with official investigation had addressed one of the crowd's primary concerns, while Washington's commitment to immediate reporting provided assurance that their information would reach appropriate authorities. At the same time, the gathering of 40 German civilians outside the displaced persons camp created ongoing security concerns that required careful management. "Corporal Chen," Washington said, "contact camp headquarters and request that Lieutenant Morrison come to the Eastern Gate with additional personnel. Tell him we have a situation that requires administrative follow-up but is currently under control." Chen immediately moved to his radio equipment to make the requested contact, while Washington continued to maintain his protective position relative to Zimmerman. The young woman had remained calm throughout the confrontation, demonstrating remarkable composure under circumstances that would have challenged anyone's emotional stability. The crowd's behavior had also shown encouraging restraint, with individual anger and frustration being channeled into collective discussion rather than escalating to physical confrontation. Brenner's moderating influence had been crucial in maintaining this outcome, suggesting the importance of identifying and engaging with responsible community leaders in managing occupation-related tensions. As they waited for additional American personnel to arrive, Washington took the opportunity to observe the crowd more carefully and assess the likelihood of renewed problems once the immediate situation concluded. Several individuals had already departed, apparently satisfied that their concerns had been heard and would receive official attention. Others remained but appeared more curious than hostile, suggesting that their continued presence reflected interest in the outcome rather than intent to create further confrontation. Among those who remained, Washington noticed a middle-aged woman who had been particularly vocal during the early stages of the confrontation, but who now appeared subdued and thoughtful. Her change in demeanor suggested possible reconsideration of her initial response, perhaps influenced by the development of dialogue between Brenner and the American personnel. Within 10 minutes, Lieutenant Morrison arrived with 3 additional soldiers, providing sufficient American presence to manage any potential escalation while demonstrating serious attention to the situation. Morrison, a 26-year-old officer from Ohio who had joined the 361st Infantry Regiment during the Italian campaign, brought both military experience and administrative competence to the developing situation. "Sergeant Washington," Morrison said after surveying the scene, "brief me on the current status." Washington provided a concise summary of events, including the crowd's allegations against Zimmerman, her offer to cooperate with official investigation, and his commitment to Brenner regarding immediate reporting to appropriate authorities. Morrison listened carefully, asking clarifying questions about specific details and the current mood of the German civilians. "Understood," Morrison replied. "I'll take responsibility for administrative follow-up with division headquarters regarding potential investigation procedures. For now, let's focus on concluding this situation safely and getting everyone back to their normal activities." Morrison's arrival allowed Washington to step back from direct crowd management, while maintaining his protective position relative to Zimmermann. The lieutenant's authority provided additional credibility for any commitments made to the German civilians regarding official attention to their concerns. Morrison approached Brenner and engaged in a brief conversation that reiterated Washington's earlier assurances while adding the weight of commissioned officer authority. The exchange was conducted in English, with Chen providing translation assistance, ensuring clear communication about expectations and commitments from both sides. "Mr. Brenner," Morrison said, "Sergeant Washington has briefed me on your community's concerns about this woman's wartime activities and possible information regarding missing persons. I want to confirm that this matter will be reported immediately to our division's Civil Affairs Office, which handles investigations of this type. You should expect contact from Allied authorities within 48 hours regarding procedures for providing formal statements about your specific concerns." This more detailed commitment provided the kind of concrete timeline and process description that addressed Brenner's earlier concerns about vague promises of proper channels. Morrison's specification of the Civil Affairs Office and 48-hour time frame demonstrated familiarity with actual administrative procedures rather than merely bureaucratic deflection. Brenner translated Morrison's statement to the remaining crowd members, generating what appeared to be generally positive responses. Several individuals nodded approval, while others engaged in brief discussions that seemed focused on practical questions about providing formal statements rather than continued challenge to the American intervention. With the crowd's concerns adequately addressed and official follow-up procedures established, the immediate confrontation had been successfully de-escalated. However, the broader implications of Washington's decision to protect Zimmermann would continue to resonate within both the German community and American occupation personnel. Morrison's next concern involved ensuring Zimmermann's continued safety while respecting her rights as a displaced person seeking to leave the camp voluntarily. The young woman's original purpose in departing the camp remained unclear, but her right to do so could not be compromised by community hostility or security concerns. "Miss Zimmermann," Morrison said, "you are free to continue with your business outside the camp. However, I would recommend that you consider whether your immediate safety might be better served by postponing whatever activities brought you to the gate today. The situation here appears to be resolved, but community tensions may require some time to settle completely." Zimmermann considered Morrison's suggestion carefully before responding. Her decision would provide insight into both her personal courage and her assessment of the risks she faced from continued community hostility. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she replied. "I was going to visit the town medical clinic to inquire about possible employment opportunities. Perhaps it would be better to make this inquiry through official channels instead of direct approach." This explanation of her intended destination provided important context for understanding both her motivations and her qualifications. The reference to employment at a medical clinic confirmed earlier observations about her medical background, while suggesting practical concerns about economic survival in post-war Germany. Morrison nodded approval of her decision to postpone the clinic visit. "That seems like a prudent approach. I can arrange for appropriate contacts to be made through our Civil Affairs Office, which can provide proper introductions and ensure that any employment arrangements comply with occupation regulations." The conclusion of this immediate crisis marked the beginning of longer-term consequences that would affect all the participants in different ways. For Washington, his decision to interpose himself between Zimmermann and the hostile crowd had demonstrated both personal courage and commitment to fundamental principles of human dignity, regardless of nationality or wartime history. However, it had also involved him in local German political disputes in ways that contradicted official occupation policies. For Zimmermann, the confrontation had forced her to confront community suspicions about her wartime role while demonstrating her willingness to cooperate with official investigation. Her offer to provide information about missing persons suggested both personal integrity and recognition of legitimate community needs for accountability and closure. For the German civilians represented by Brenner, the incident had shown both the constraints and the responsiveness of American occupation authority. Their concerns had been heard and official follow-up had been promised, but the broader questions of wartime justice and accountability remained complex and difficult to resolve through formal procedures. As the crowd began to disperse and normal activities resumed around the displaced persons camp, Washington reflected on the morning's events and their broader significance. His intervention had been instinctive, driven by immediate recognition of an individual facing mob intimidation rather than careful calculation of policy implications or political consequences. The parallels with his own experiences as a Black American facing hostile crowds in Detroit were impossible to ignore. The dynamics of group hostility toward isolated individuals transcended national boundaries and historical circumstances, creating moral imperatives that operated independently of legal frameworks or political considerations. Washington's military service had exposed him to the ironies and contradictions that characterized American participation in the European conflict. He had fought for democratic principles and human dignity while serving in a segregated army that denied him equal treatment with white soldiers. Now he found himself protecting a German civilian against other German civilians, while representing an occupation authority that maintained complex and sometimes contradictory policies toward the defeated population. The successful resolution of the morning's crisis had avoided immediate violence, while establishing procedures for addressing legitimate community concerns through proper channels. However, it had also highlighted the ongoing tensions between individual protection and collective justice that would continue to challenge occupation authorities throughout the Reconstruction period. As Washington returned to his regular security duties, he was approached by Corporal Johnson, a fellow black soldier from the regiment's 2nd Company, who had observed the confrontation from a distance. "Sergeant," Johnson said quietly, "that took guts, stepping in like that. Lot of guys might have decided it wasn't our problem to solve." Washington considered Johnson's comment carefully. The decision to intervene had felt natural and necessary at the time, but he understood that other soldiers might have made different choices based on their assessment of competing obligations and risks. "Just seemed like the right thing to do," Washington replied. "Nobody deserves to face down a mob by themselves, regardless of what else might be going on." Johnson nodded, understanding. "I hear you. Just saying it took courage to make that call in the moment, especially with all the complications around here." The conversation between the two black soldiers reflected broader themes about moral courage and individual responsibility that extended beyond the specific circumstances of occupation duty. Their shared experience as members of a racial minority within the American military provided a particular perspective on questions of justice, protection, and human dignity. Over the following days, Washington's intervention became a topic of discussion among both American personnel and German civilians in the Mannheim area. The incident was interpreted differently by various observers, reflecting the complex and often contradictory viewpoints that characterized post-war German-American relations. Some American officers viewed Washington's action as appropriate protection of displaced persons under military supervision, demonstrating proper execution of humanitarian responsibilities. Others were concerned about the precedent of American involvement in German community disputes and the potential for similar incidents to escalate beyond manageable limits. Among German civilians, reactions ranged from appreciation for American fairness and protection of individual rights to resentment about foreign interference in local justice questions. The diversity of responses reflected the broader ambivalence that characterized German attitudes toward the American occupation, grateful for protection from Soviet control while resistant to foreign authority over domestic affairs. Lieutenant Morrison's promised follow-up with division headquarters resulted in a formal investigation of Zimmerman's wartime activities conducted by Allied civil affairs personnel. The investigation process provided opportunities for German civilians to present their concerns and questions about missing relatives while ensuring appropriate legal protections for all parties involved. The investigation revealed that Zimmerman had indeed worked at a German military medical facility during the war's final months, but her role had been limited to nursing care rather than administrative or decision-making responsibilities. More significantly, testimony from multiple sources confirmed that she had provided medical assistance to Allied prisoners of war and foreign laborers in violation of German regulations, actions that had ultimately led to her own detention and transfer to a labor camp. These findings transformed community perceptions of Zimmermann from suspected collaborator to recognized victim of German wartime policies. Several families received information about missing relatives through her testimony, providing closure that had been unavailable through other sources. The investigation process also established procedures for addressing similar cases throughout the American occupation zone. For Washington, the long-term consequences of his intervention extended beyond the immediate resolution of the crisis. His action was noted in his personnel file as demonstrating initiative and moral courage under challenging circumstances, contributing to his selection for promotion to Staff Sergeant 6 weeks later. More importantly, his willingness to protect an individual facing mob intimidation became part of his unit's institutional memory and cultural identity. The incident also influenced American occupation policies regarding community relations and individual protection. Military commanders recognized the need for clearer guidelines regarding soldier intervention in disputes between German civilians while maintaining commitments to protecting displaced persons under Allied supervision. Several months after the initial confrontation, Zimmermann was able to secure employment at a civilian medical clinic in Mannheim, working under supervision of Allied medical personnel to provide healthcare services to both displaced persons and German civilians. Her professional competence and demonstrated integrity during the investigation process had restored community confidence while providing practical opportunities for post-war reconstruction. Heinrich Brenner, the German civilian who had served as community spokesman during the confrontation, later approached Washington to express appreciation for the respectful manner in which American personnel had addressed local concerns. This gesture represented broader German recognition that American occupation policies, despite their constraints and complexities, generally attempted to balance competing interests fairly. The relationship between Washington and Morrison evolved into a professional partnership that influenced their unit's approach to community relations throughout the remaining months of occupation duty. Their collaboration demonstrated the importance of effective communication between enlisted personnel with direct civilian contact and commissioned officers with administrative authority. As summer progressed into autumn of 1946, the immediate tensions surrounding Zimmermann's case had been resolved, but the broader themes it represented continued to shape daily life in occupied Germany. Questions of wartime accountability, post-war justice, individual protection, and community reconciliation remained central challenges for both American occupation authorities and German civilian populations. Washington's decision to place himself between Zimmermann and the hostile crowd had been motivated by immediate recognition of individual vulnerability rather than comprehensive analysis of policy implications. However, the incident's resolution demonstrated that principled individual action could contribute to broader progress toward justice and reconciliation in post-war Europe. The sergeant's intervention had required him to draw upon multiple sources of strength and wisdom: his military training in crisis management, his personal experience with hostile crowds and racial prejudice, his moral commitment to protecting vulnerable individuals, and his practical understanding of occupation duties and responsibilities. The success of his intervention depended not only on his individual courage, but also on the support provided by Corporal Chen, the leadership demonstrated by Lieutenant Morrison, and the fundamental reasonableness of community representatives like Heinrich Brenner. The collaborative nature of the crisis resolution reflected broader themes about democratic values and cooperative problem-solving. For Greta Zimmermann, the confrontation had provided an opportunity to address community suspicions while demonstrating her willingness to accept accountability for her wartime actions. Her cooperation with the subsequent investigation had enabled families to obtain information about missing relatives while restoring her own reputation within the local community. The medical clinic position that Zimmermann eventually obtained allowed her to contribute positively to post-war reconstruction while utilizing her professional skills for community benefit. Her transition from suspected collaborator to valued healthcare provider illustrated the potential for individual redemption and community healing within broader processes of post-war reconciliation. As the American occupation of Germany continued through 1947 and beyond, the lessons learned from incidents like the confrontation at the displaced persons camp informed evolving policies and procedures for managing complex relationships between occupation authorities, displaced persons, and German civilian populations. Washington's military service in occupied Germany concluded in March 1947 when the 361st Infantry Regiment was rotated back to the United States. His 19 months of occupation duty had provided extensive experience with the challenges and opportunities of post-war reconstruction, while reinforcing his personal commitment to principles of human dignity and individual protection. Upon return to civilian life in Detroit, Washington used educational benefits provided by the GI Bill to attend Wayne State University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in social work and later a master's degree in public administration. His career in social services and municipal government was influenced by his military experience with cross-cultural relations and crisis management. The integration of American military forces, which had begun during the final stages of World War II and accelerated during the occupation period, provided Washington with opportunities to serve alongside soldiers from diverse backgrounds while demonstrating leadership capabilities that transcended racial boundaries. His promotion to staff sergeant and subsequent recognition for his intervention on behalf of Zimmermann contributed to broader progress toward equal opportunity within the American military. Heinrich Brenner's post-war life included active participation in German reconstruction efforts and community organizations focused on documenting wartime experiences and promoting reconciliation between former enemies. His positive interaction with American occupation personnel influenced his support for democratic institutions and Atlantic Alliance relationships during the Cold War period. Greta Zimmermann continued her medical career in Germany throughout the 1950s and 60s, eventually specializing in pediatric nursing and earning recognition for her contributions to child health care services. Her wartime experiences and post-war investigation had provided her with unique perspectives on medical ethics and professional responsibility that informed her later work. The displaced persons camp outside Mannheim operated until late 1947, when the successful repatriation of most displaced persons and the stabilization of German civilian governance allowed for its closure. The facility's transformation from temporary refugee housing to permanent residential development reflected broader patterns of post-war reconstruction and normalization. Lieutenant Morrison's military career included subsequent service during the Korean conflict and advancement to field-grade rank before his retirement in 1962. His administrative handling of the Zimmermann incident was noted in his personnel evaluations and contributed to his selection for advanced training in civil affairs and military government operations. Corporal Chen's language skills and cultural sensitivity led to his assignment with Allied occupation authorities in Japan, where he served during the Reconstruction period from 1947 to 1949. His experience with German-American relations provided valuable background for managing similar challenges in post-war Japanese society. The broader significance of Washington's intervention extended beyond its immediate resolution of a specific crisis to encompass larger themes about moral courage, individual responsibility, and the application of democratic principles under challenging circumstances. His decision to protect Zimmermann reflected values that transcended national boundaries and wartime loyalties. The incident also illustrated the complex relationship between individual actions and institutional policies during periods of historical transition. Washington's intervention had operated within established military frameworks, while challenging implicit assumptions about the appropriate level of involvement in local German disputes. As the Cold War developed during the late 1940s and early 1950s, the American occupation of Germany evolved from temporary military administration to permanent alliance partnership. The lessons learned from incidents like the confrontation at the Mannheim displaced persons camp informed broader American approaches to international relations and alliance management. The success of German reconstruction and democratization during the post-war period reflected countless individual decisions and actions by both American personnel and German civilians who chose cooperation and reconciliation over continued hostility and revenge. Washington's intervention on behalf of Zimmermann represented one small but significant example of such constructive choices. The transformation of Germany from defeated enemy to valued ally within the span of a few years demonstrated the potential for rapid progress toward international reconciliation when supported by principled leadership and mutual commitment to democratic values. Individual actions like Washington's intervention contributed to broader patterns of trust-building and cooperation. For American society, the experience of military occupation duty in Germany provided returning veterans with new perspectives on international relations, cultural diversity, and the practical application of democratic principles. These experiences influenced post-war American attitudes toward international engagement and alliance relationships. The integration of military forces during and after World War II represented significant progress toward racial equality within American society, while highlighting continued challenges regarding civil rights and equal opportunity. Washington's military service and subsequent civilian career reflected broader patterns of advancement achieved by black veterans during the post-war period. The documentation and remembrance of incidents like the confrontation at Mannheim contributed to historical understanding of occupation experiences while preserving important lessons about moral courage and individual responsibility for future generations. Such stories provided concrete examples of democratic values in action during challenging historical circumstances. As Washington reflected on his military service in later years, he recognized that his decision to protect Zimmermann had been shaped by multiple influences: his personal experience with racial prejudice and mob intimidation, his military training in individual protection and crisis management, his moral commitment to human dignity regardless of nationality or wartime history, and his practical understanding of occupation duties and responsibilities. The successful resolution of the crisis had required cooperation between American personnel with different backgrounds and responsibilities, German civilians with competing concerns and interests, and institutional frameworks designed to balance individual protection with community accountability. This collaborative approach provided a model for addressing similar challenges in other post-war situations. The incident's long-term positive outcomes for all parties involved demonstrated the potential benefits of principled intervention in situations involving individual vulnerability and community hostility. Washington's courage in placing himself between Zimmermann and the crowd had created opportunities for dialogue, investigation, and ultimately reconciliation that might not have emerged through other approaches. The broader themes represented by the confrontation at Mannheim, questions of justice and mercy, individual protection and community accountability, wartime responsibility and post-war reconciliation, continued to influence American foreign policy and international relations throughout the Cold War period and beyond. For contemporary audiences, the story of Washington's intervention provides important lessons about moral courage, cross-cultural understanding, and the practical application of democratic principles under challenging circumstances. These lessons remain relevant for addressing current challenges involving individual protection, community relations, and international cooperation. The transformation of former enemies into trusted allies through principled engagement and mutual commitment to democratic values represents one of the most significant achievements of American foreign policy during the 20th century. Individual actions like Washington's intervention contributed to broader patterns of progress that continue to shape international relations in the 21st century. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.